All right, welcome back to another deep dive where we get our hands dirty with some really cool research.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be tackling psychopathology
Okay.
from this chapter that I read recently, and it really had me hooked. So,
Oh, awesome. Yeah, it's
what is it about psychopathology?
it's a fascinating topic, right? I mean, it's so often we get these very simplistic explanations for these very complex issues, but this chapter that you're referencing really digs deep into the many layers, the complexity of it all.
I like it. So what should the listener be walking away with today?
Well, I mean, the goal here is to equip you all with the knowledge to understand the interplay of the various factors that contribute to mental health. And this is things like biology, psychology, social influences, and development. And it's really to understand how these things all kind of come together. And it's not just one thing or the other. It's really a combination of many factors.
It's almost like a puzzle.
Yeah, exactly.
And each piece is informing the bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think this chapter does a really good job of outlining that.
Okay, so how does the chapter break this down? I mean, where do we even begin?
Well, imagine you're a detective. You know, you wouldn't jump to conclusions right away without first, kind of getting your ducks in a row.
Right.
This chapter takes a very similar approach to this very complex topic.
Okay.
It starts by outlining some basic concepts, and then we kind of look at each factor that contributes, kind of like, the different suspects in a case.
Yeah.
And then it all comes together at the end when we look at how these things are all interrelated.
So no jumping to conclusion.
Jumping to conclusion.
We're going to be methodical about it.
Yes.
So I like it.
Step by step.
So speaking of jumping to conclusions, though, I have to admit, like, when I first started reading about psychopathology, I found myself wanting simple answers. Like, is it just this one thing?
Right, and that's natural, right? I mean, we all, want simple answers to these complex things, but unfortunately, it's not always that easy.
It's not.
One of these, like, very simplistic or one-dimensional models is, for example, attributing schizophrenia to only a chemical imbalance in the brain.
Right.
It completely ignores the role of genetics, personal experiences, social context, and many other things.
Right.
So it's much more complex than that. And these one-dimensional models are appealing because of their simplicity, but really they fall short.
They're too simple.
Way too simple.
So if we want to move beyond that, what's the alternative?
So really the alternative is to embrace this multidimensional model, which emphasizes that, no single factor acts in isolation, and it's not either or.
Yeah.
But it's an interplay of all of these factors.
I see.
And so I like to think of it like a spider web. When you tug on one strand of a spider web, the entire web vibrates.
Right.
And that's kind of how this multidimensional model works.
Okay, so all these factors are really intertwined.
Exactly.
When we can't really pull one out without affecting the others.
Exactly.
Okay, and speaking of webs, it makes me think of genes, right?
Yeah.
But something that was fascinating in this chapter was that genes really aren't destiny.
Right.
Right? It's not like just having, a depression gene or an anxiety gene or something.
Right.
It's more complicated than that.
Yeah. It's far more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Most traits, including vulnerability to certain disorders, are what we call polygenic.
Okay.
This means they're influenced by many genes, each contributing just a little bit to the bigger picture.
Okay, so it's not just one gene flips a switch and suddenly you're depressed.
No, it's a combination of many genes.
A whole bunch of them all working together.
And all interacting with one another.
Okay, so where does environment come in? Because I also read something about genes being turned on and off by environment, and that just blew my mind.
And that is true. Think of genes as blueprints, but the way these blueprints are expressed can actually be modified by the environment. And so, for example, there were these studies done with rat pups.
Okay.
And the quality of maternal care they received actually affected the expression of a gene that regulates stress hormones.
Wait, so like how much the mom took care of the rat pups?
Exactly.
Affected the expression of genes.
Exactly.
Wow.
And so the pups who received less nurturing care actually grew up more sensitive to stress.
Wow.
Because that gene wasn't turned on.
Okay, so it's really not just nature versus nurture.
No, it's this interplay, this dynamic interplay.
Right, it's both.
between genes and environment. And really one of the classic models that looks at this is the diathesis-stress model.
Okay, what is the diathesis-stress model?
So the diathesis-stress model basically states that you inherit a predisposition to a certain disorder, but this doesn't necessarily mean you're going to develop the disorder.
Yeah.
But when this predisposition is combined with significant environmental stressors, then that's when the likelihood of that disorder emerging really comes into play.
So the diathesis is like the loaded gun and the stress is the trigger.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. All right.
So you can have a loaded gun, but it's not going to fire unless you pull the trigger.
Right.
And the trigger is really the environment.
Okay, so do we have any real-world examples of this diathesis-stress model?
Yeah, so there was this really landmark study in New Zealand that followed people for over 2 decades.
Oh, wow.
And it started when they were children.
Oh, wow.
And it looked at the gene that affects serotonin transmission.
Okay, so this is really related to mood then.
Exactly. And they discovered that people with a particular version of this gene were more likely to experience depression, but only if they also experienced significant life stress.
Okay, so it's not just the genes alone.
No, it's a combination of the two.
It's both.
The genes and the environment.
Okay, and is there another model that kind of goes a little bit deeper into this gene-environment interaction? Because I remember reading something about genes influencing the types of environments we seek out.
Yeah, so that's the gene-environment correlation model.
Okay.
And this model basically suggests that our genes influence the environments we seek out, the experiences we have, and even the relationships we form.
Wow, so our genes are playing matchmaker.
In sense.
Yes, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Can you give me a concrete example of this?
Yeah, so imagine somebody has a genetic predisposition to a blood injection injury phobia.
Okay.
But they also have a tendency towards being impulsive. Now, this impulsivity could make them more prone to minor accidents like scraping their knee or getting a paper cut.
Yeah.
And because these events involve blood, it could actually trigger their phobia.
So it's almost like they're setting themselves up for these situations that trigger their phobia.
Exactly, exactly. It's like their genes are kind of, pulling them in that direction.
Oh, wow. That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about genetics. Can we now talk about epigenetics?
Yeah.
Which is this idea that our environment can leave lasting marks on our genes, which is crazy.
Yeah, it's really groundbreaking stuff.
Yeah.
So epigenetics is essentially saying that our experiences like stress, nutrition, trauma, can actually modify what's called the epigenome, which is a set of instructions that sits on top of our DNA.
Oh, wow.
That regulates how these genes are expressed.
So it's not that our DNA changes.
Right.
It's how it's being read that can change.
Exactly.
Okay, that's pretty wild, but doesn't that kind of make us more responsible for our genes? And what does that mean for like future generations?
Well, it definitely makes you think about the long-term consequences of our actions and, the environments we create. But there's also hope in this because the genome itself doesn't actually change. So while these modifications can have lasting effects, they're not necessarily permanent.
Okay.
So, there's this potential for things to shift and change.
Right. There's that plasticity.
Exactly.
I like it.
So yeah, it's a new area of research.
Okay, before we move on from genetics, I have to ask about twins.
Yeah.
Right, because if genes are so impactful, wouldn't identical twins be the same?
Well, and that's where those twin studies, and especially twins that were raised apart, really come into play, and it just highlights how powerful the environment can be, even with identical genes.
Right.
So, I mean, a classic case was the conjoined twins Chang and Eng Bunker.
Oh, yeah?
From the 1800s.
When did they have the original Siamese twins or something?
Right, yeah.
I think so.
And so, they shared the same genes and technically the same environment being physically connected, but they had strikingly different personalities.
Wow.
Chang was very prone to mood swings, and he actually struggled with alcohol.
Wow.
Eng was much more even-tempered and thoughtful.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so very different life paths.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that really does highlight the interaction of all these different factors. I mean, it's not just one thing that makes us who we are.
It's this combination of many things.
Okay, so can we move on to the brain now and like neuroscience?
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's take a tour of that command center.
All right, so the human nervous system is really a very complex communication network.
Okay.
And the central nervous system is at its core.
Okay.
This includes the brain and spinal cord.
Okay.
And this is what processes information and coordinates all the actions.
Okay.
And then there's the peripheral nervous system,
okay,
which carries signals between the central nervous system and the rest of your body.
I see. So that's like the messenger.
Exactly.
Okay, I like it.
So there's this constant communication going on.
Right. So many signals flying around.
Yeah.
Can we zoom in on the brain? And I remember reading about different brain structures and functions.
So think of the brain as having different neighborhoods,
Okay.
each with its own specialty.
Okay.
You've got the brainstem, which is the oldest part of the brain. And it's really responsible for those essential automatic functions like breathing and sleeping.
Okay.
And then you have the limbic system, which is involved in emotional regulation.
The limbic system, that's the one that deals with emotions, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And this is often implicated in various psychopathologies.
Okay, so what about the thinking part of the brain?
So that's the cerebral cortex.
Okay.
And it's the largest part of the brain.
Oh.
And it's what really sets us apart from other animals.
Okay.
It gives us these higher level thinking abilities, like language and reasoning.
Okay.
And within the cortex, the frontal lobe, particularly the prefrontal cortex, is especially important.
The frontal lobe, that's like right behind our foreheads, right?
Exactly.
So what makes that so important?
So this is the executive control center.
Oh, wow.
And it's involved in planning, decision-making, regulating emotions, and controlling impulses. And all of these things can go awry in many mental health disorders.
Right, right.
And so when researchers are studying things like depression or anxiety, they often focus on this area.
I see.
Because of its role in regulating emotional responses.
So it's like the CEO of our brain.
Yeah.
Making sure everything is working properly.
Keeping everything in check.
Okay, what about those chemical messengers that allow these different parts of the brain to communicate?
Yeah.
I'm talking about neurotransmitters, right?
Right.
Okay, how do these little guys have such a big impact?
So neurotransmitters are fascinating.
Yeah.
Think of them as like tiny couriers carrying messages between neurons.
Okay.
And they either trigger or inhibit activity.
Okay.
And while they are crucial for brain function, it's not as simple as having too much or too little of one specific chemical.
Okay. Yeah. I used to think like depression is just low serotonin.
Right. Yeah.
But it's more than that.
Yeah.
Right?
Much more than that.
Okay.
So it's about the intricate interplay of various neurotransmitters.
Okay.
And how those interactions affect information processing throughout the brain.
I see.
It's less about the ingredients and more about the recipe, how these things are combined and interact.
So it's not just about having all the right stuff. It's how they work together.
It's about the symphony of brain chemistry.
Okay. Can we at least talk about some of the key players in this symphony?
Yeah. So why don't we start with glutamate and GABA?
Okay.
So these are essential for regulating brain activity.
Yeah.
Glutamate is kind of like the brain's on switch.
Okay.
It excites neurons and it leads to action.
Okay.
GABA, on the other hand, is the off switch.
Okay.
It inhibits neuronal firing and kind of calms things down.
Oh, okay. So it's all about finding the right balance between...
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. It's all about balance.
So glutamate gets things going.
Yeah.
And GABA chills things out.
Exactly. It puts on the brakes.
I like it.
Yeah.
So what about serotonin? Because that always comes up when we're talking about mood.
Yeah, so serotonin plays a wide range of roles, from regulating mood and sleep to influencing appetite and impulse control.
Okay, so it does a lot.
It does a lot, yeah.
And low serotonin activity has been linked to depression and anxiety, but it's not a simple cause and effect relationship.
No, it's this interplay of many factors.
Right.
How it interacts with other neurotransmitters and influences different brain circuits.
I see. What about norepinephrine?
So norepinephrine is often called the fight-or-flight neurotransmitter.
Okay, yeah.
It kicks in when we face danger.
Right.
It increases alertness, prepares our bodies to respond to the threat.
Right.
But when this system is overactive, it can contribute to anxiety, panic attacks, and even PTSD.
So it's like having that alarm system on all the time.
Yeah.
Even when there's nothing to worry about.
Even when there's no real danger.
Yeah, okay. And finally, what about dopamine?
So dopamine is fascinating because it's so intertwined with our experience of pleasure and reward.
Right.
It plays a key role in motivation and enjoyment.
Okay.
Which is why it's heavily implicated in addiction.
Right, right.
But it's also involved in other disorders.
Okay.
Like schizophrenia and ADHD.
So it's like the reward system, but if it's not working properly, it can lead us down some bad paths.
Right.
Okay, so we've explored brain structure, these communication pathways, and these key neurotransmitters.
Yeah.
But what about the software? How do our thoughts, behaviors, and emotions influence mental health?
That's a great question, and that's where cognitive science and the realm of psychology really come into play.
Okay, like it.
So while biology lays this foundation, our experiences, interpretations, and learned behaviors also shape who we are
Okay.
and how we navigate the world, and these can either contribute to or protect us
Right.
from psychological disorders.
I see. So I want to delve into thoughts, behaviors, and emotions.
Okay, yeah.
What is cognitive science all about?
So cognitive science has really revealed that a lot of our information processing happens outside of our conscious awareness.
That's so weird.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's like there's this whole world going on in our brain that we don't even know about.
Exactly. It's like there's this unconscious world operating behind the scenes. And, this is not necessarily the Freudian unconscious filled with repressed desires or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's really a system that efficiently handles vast amounts of information without bogging us down with conscious thought.
I see.
And a great example of this is this phenomenon of blindsight.
Blindsight. What is that?
So there are these individuals who, due to brain damage, are technically blind.
Okay.
They can't consciously perceive visual information, but remarkably, when they're tested, they can still navigate obstacles and even guess the location of objects.
Wow.
So it's almost as if their unconscious mind is still processing this information.
Wow, so they can't see it,
Right.
but their brain still knows where things are.
Exactly. They're not consciously aware of it, but their brain is still processing it.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So how does this relate to psychopathology?
So cognitive science helps us understand how learning and conditioning processes can actually contribute to the development and maintenance of disorders.
Okay.
For example, take the concept of learned helplessness.
Okay.
So Martin Seligman found that when animals experience uncontrollable stress,
Okay.
they actually give up trying to cope.
Really? Even if there's a way out?
Yeah, so they learn that their actions have no impact
Right.
on their situation, and they develop this sense of helplessness.
Okay.
And this actually applies to humans as well.
Okay.
So if we repeatedly face situations where we feel powerless, we might develop this learned helplessness that contributes to depression or anxiety.
So giving up,
Exactly.
right? Because it's like, what's the point?
What's the point?
Yeah, okay, so how does social environment come in? I mean,
Yeah.
we're not just individuals walking around.
Yeah, exactly.
We're in constant contact with each other.
Exactly. So social learning theory, which was championed by Albert Bandura, really emphasizes how much we learn by observing others, and this is called modeling.
Modeling, okay.
So think about how children learn social behaviors, language, even fears just by watching their parents or siblings.
Right, so we're kind of like sponges,
Exactly.
soaking up all this information from our social surroundings.
And these can influence not just our behaviors, but also our emotions and even our vulnerabilities to certain disorders.
So it's not just like how to act, but
Yeah.
also how to feel.
Exactly. It's picking up cues from our environment.
Okay, what about this thing called prepared learning?
Yeah.
Because this idea that we're evolutionarily primed to fear certain things more easily is fascinating to me.
Yeah, so prepared learning is fascinating, and it suggests that over the course of human evolution, certain fears have become ingrained in us because they were critical
Right.
for survival. So things like snakes, spiders, heights,
Right.
these are fears that are really common across cultures.
Right, we all seem to have them.
Yeah, and they often emerge early in life, even without any direct negative experiences.
So it's like our ancestors who were afraid of those things
Exactly.
survived and passed those fears on to us.
Exactly, yeah.
But why those things? Why not like cars? Why not electrical outlets?
That's a great question, and it gets at the heart of this evolutionary argument,
Yeah.
Our ancestors didn't have to worry about getting hit by a car.
Right.
But they did have to watch out for these venomous creatures.
Right, that makes sense.
So these primal fears were adaptive.
Okay.
They helped our ancestors avoid danger.
Okay.
And it's possible that, these fears that were passed down through generations contribute to why we still have these instinctive reactions today.
So we still have that manual
Exactly.
encoded in our DNA.
Encoded in our DNA.
Wow. Okay, so can we finally talk about emotions?
Yeah.
I mean, emotions are so powerful, And they must play a big role in psychopathology.
They absolutely do. So emotions really color our perceptions, they shape our thoughts, and they drive our actions.
Okay.
And when these emotions become dysregulated, whether it's too intense, too persistent, or inappropriate for the situation,
Right.
that's when they can contribute to these mental health challenges.
So dysregulated emotions, so it's like the volume's up too high.
Exactly.
Or it's pointed in the wrong direction.
Or they're just not fitting
Right.
the situation.
Okay, so can we back up and define what we mean by emotion? Because
Yeah.
it's something we all experience, but it's hard to really put your finger on what it is.
Yeah, so think of emotion as a multifaceted experience involving a subjective feeling state, a physiological response, and a behavioral tendency.
Okay.
So, for example, when you encounter a threat,
Right.
you might feel fear,
Right.
your heart might race, and you might have an urge to flee.
Right.
So those three components, the feeling, the physical change, and that action tendency, work together to create that emotional experience.
So it's like a symphony of the mind and body working together.
Exactly.
But how do emotions relate to survival?
So emotions, especially things like fear and anger, are deeply rooted in our survival instincts.
Okay.
They evolved to help us navigate danger and protect ourselves.
Okay.
So think about that classic fight or flight response, you know? When our ancestors encountered a predator, their bodies flooded with adrenaline, preparing them to either fight or flee.
Right.
And that surge of energy and those instinctive reactions were crucial for survival.
Right, because they needed to act quickly
Exactly.
and decisively.
Yeah.
So what about when our emotional responses seem like out of proportion to the situation? Like, why would someone be afraid to get in an elevator?
Yeah, and that's a great question.
Or terrified of spiders?
And that's where those intricate interactions between biology, psychology, and environment come in.
Okay.
So sometimes our emotional responses become dysregulated due to a combination of factors.
Okay.
So it could be a genetic predisposition interacting with stressful life events, learned associations from past experiences, or even cultural influences that shape how we express and regulate those emotions.
Right. So it's not just about the emotion itself, it's how we interpret it.
Yeah, the meaning we give to it.
Yeah, and how we manage those feelings.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to talk about the fascinating ways culture and social factors influence how we experience psychopathology. Because we're not just products of our biology, right?
Absolutely not. So culture and social factors play a huge role in everything from our beliefs about mental health to how we seek help.
Okay.
And even what types of disorders we might be more prone to experiencing.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Give me an example.
Yeah. So have you ever heard of the phenomenon of voodoo death?
Voodoo death? No. Tell me more.
So it's documented in several cultures
where
individuals believe they've been cursed or targeted by black magic, and they actually die from fright. Yeah, so there's no physical attack or anything like that, but the belief in the curse, coupled with the social isolation and the lack of support, can create such intense fear and physiological stress that it can actually lead to death.
That's both fascinating and scary.
Yeah.
It really shows the power of belief and how much our minds and bodies are intertwined.
Exactly. Yeah, it really underscores how psychopathology isn't just about what's happening inside our heads, but also about the cultural narratives that we subscribe to, the social support that we have, and even the stigma surrounding mental health. And so I think that's a great place to pause for now.
Okay.
And we can dig deeper into those fascinating cultural and social influences.
Yes, I like it.
In the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
All right, so welcome back. I'm glad we could pick up where we left off, talking about the power of these social and cultural influences on psychopathology.
Right, and I'm really excited to get into that. I'm especially curious about how culture might shape the actual way we experience a disorder.
Yeah, it's fascinating how cultural norms can influence not only how we think about mental health, but also the specific symptoms that we express.
Okay.
So, for example, let's look at anxiety.
Okay.
In some cultures, anxiety might manifest primarily as physical symptoms, things like headaches or fatigue.
Oh, okay.
But in other cultures, it might show up more as emotional distress or social anxiety.
So it can look totally different depending on where you are.
Exactly.
And your cultural background.
Yeah.
That's wild. And that makes me think about gender roles.
Yeah.
And how they might tie into all of this.
Yeah.
Because we briefly talked about how gender can influence the likelihood of developing certain disorders like phobias.
Right.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so gender roles are so deeply embedded in cultural expectations, and they can really have a huge impact on how we experience and express psychopathology.
Okay.
So let's stick with that phobia example.
Okay.
Women statistically are more likely to develop phobias of insects or small animals and blood.
Yeah. Why is that?
So some researchers think that this difference might actually be linked to those traditional gender roles. You know, the ones that historically encouraged women to be more nurturing and protective of children, while men were expected to be more assertive and risk-taking.
So almost like they would be more aware
Right.
of things that could put their families in danger?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a really thought-provoking perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if, like, those ingrained expectations
Yeah.
might also influence how we even seek help or how mental health professionals interpret symptoms.
Absolutely. And there's actually been a lot of research on how gender bias can unfortunately creep into diagnosis and treatment.
Yeah, and lead to misdiagnosis or inadequate care.
Exactly. And it's a serious issue.
Yeah, it is.
And it highlights how important it is for mental health professionals to really be aware of their own biases.
Yeah.
And to approach each individual with cultural sensitivity and understanding.
Right. And with that, can we talk about social support?
Yes.
Because we are social creatures, and I imagine those connections
Yes.
must play a big role in mental well-being.
There's no question about it. And study after study shows that strong social networks are linked to better physical and mental health,
Right.
reduced risk of depression and anxiety,
Right.
and even increased longevity.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
So like having those people in your life.
Exactly. It's like having this built-in support system
Right.
to help weather those storms.
Yeah, but how does that actually work?
So there are a few theories out there. Some research suggests that social connections provide this sense of belonging and purpose,
Okay.
which helps us cope with stress and combat loneliness.
Okay.
Other studies highlight the practical benefits of having this support system, you know.
Right.
These supportive relationships offer help and resources when times get tough.
Right. Lessens the burden on the individual.
Exactly. And there's even some evidence that social interaction releases oxytocin.
Oh, wow.
Which is a hormone that's linked to feelings of trust and connection.
Okay.
And has these calming and stress-reducing effects.
So it's like a multifaceted shield.
Exactly.
Protecting us from all signs.
Yeah.
Well, what happens if that shield's not there?
So lack of social support or being in relationships that are full of conflict and isolation can actually be huge risk factors for a whole range of mental health challenges.
Right, because that shield is weakened.
Exactly.
And now we're more susceptible.
Yeah, you're more vulnerable to all those stressors.
Okay, let's talk about stigma.
Okay.
Particularly the stigma surrounding mental illness.
Yeah.
Because I think that can be such a huge barrier to getting help.
It is. It's incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
You know, it can silence people that are struggling and create this cycle of shame and isolation.
Right.
And when mental illness is seen as a weakness or a character flaw, it really makes people afraid to reach out for help.
Right. They don't want to seem weak or flawed.
Yeah, exactly.
So why does that stigma exist?
So there are a few things. I think a lack of understanding and misinformation plays a huge role.
Cool.
Mental illness is often portrayed in the media in ways that are sensationalized or just plain inaccurate.
Right.
And this can really feed fear and harmful stereotypes.
So it's not being portrayed realistically.
Exactly. And then there's the historical context.
Oh, really?
You know, for centuries, mental illness was often associated with moral failing or even possession.
Wow.
And these remnants can still linger in some cultures today.
So it's like we're battling that legacy of misinformation.
Yeah.
But how do we combat it?
So it starts with education and open conversations.
Okay.
You know, we need to challenge those harmful stereotypes with accurate information about mental illness.
Okay.
We need to encourage empathy and understanding, recognizing that mental health is just as important as physical health. And we need to create safe spaces where people feel comfortable sharing their experiences without fear of judgment.
So education, empathy, and safe spaces.
Yeah.
Those are all important.
They're the foundation.
Okay, let's talk about the global perspective.
Okay.
Because mental health challenges aren't limited to just one country or one culture.
No, absolutely not. So mental health is a global concern.
Right.
And the World Health Organization estimates that mental disorders account for a significant portion of the global burden of disease.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But I imagine access to mental health care varies greatly.
It does, yeah. It varies drastically around the world.
Right, especially in countries that might have more limited resources.
Exactly. So in many developing countries, resources are scarce, stigma is pervasive,
Okay.
and traditional beliefs about mental illness often overshadow those modern medical approaches.
Wow.
And this really highlights the need for greater investment in mental health services worldwide
Right.
and a global effort to address these disparities.
It's a human rights issue.
Because everyone should have access to care.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about development
Yeah.
throughout the lifespan.
Right.
Because we're not static beings, right? We're constantly evolving.
We are.
So how do those developmental stages influence how we experience and express psychopathology?
So it's crucial to view psychopathology through that developmental lens.
Yeah.
Our brains and our bodies are constantly changing.
Right.
And these changes really affect our vulnerability to different disorders at various points in our lives.
Right. So childhood and adolescence are like
Exactly.
huge periods of change.
Yeah, periods of rapid brain development and hormonal shifts.
Right. So why are those periods so crucial to understanding psychopathology?
Because experiences during these periods,
Right.
whether they're positive or negative,
Yeah.
can have this huge impact on our mental health trajectory later on.
Okay.
So think about trauma, abuse, or neglect.
Right. These can really disrupt brain development and increase vulnerability to a whole range of disorders later in life.
So those early experiences really do shape
Yeah, they shape the foundation
the foundation.
of our mental and emotional well-being.
Okay, but what about the positive? What can we do to support healthy development?
Yeah, so that's where things like nurturing environments,
Okay.
supportive relationships, and early interventions come in.
Right.
And these can really help build resilience
Okay, I like it.
and protect against mental health challenges.
Can you give me some examples of how development influences psychopathology?
Yeah.
Like, how do these different stages impact our experience of, like, let's say, depression?
Okay, so depression can occur at any age, but it often presents differently in children and adolescents compared to adults.
Okay.
So, for example, children with depression might be more irritable
Okay.
or show more physical symptoms,
Okay.
whereas adolescents might struggle with social withdrawal or academic difficulties.
So that's not the same.
It's not the same, no.
Across the board.
No.
Okay, what about aging?
So aging comes with its own set of challenges and vulnerabilities.
Okay.
As we get older, we might face cognitive decline,
Right.
physical health problems, loss of loved ones, and increased social isolation.
Yeah.
And these factors can increase the risk of depression, anxiety, and even dementia.
Does aging automatically mean a decline in mental health?
Not necessarily, and it's important to remember that many older adults maintain their cognitive function,
Right.
their emotional well-being, and their social connections well into their later years.
Yes. So it's not a guarantee.
It's not a guarantee, no, not at all.
Okay, what can we do to support mental well-being
Yeah.
across the lifespan?
So it's really about understanding that mental health is this lifelong journey,
Okay.
and it's shaped by this complex combination of biological, psychological, social, and cultural factors
Right.
that shift and evolve as we age.
Okay.
So we need to promote mental health literacy.
Right.
At all ages, we need to create supportive environments that foster resilience. And we really need to provide access to mental health care
Right.
that's tailored to the unique needs of each developmental stage.
So mental health literacy, supportive environments, and access to care.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are all key.
They are.
Okay, can we talk about equifinality?
Yes.
Because this is this idea that different paths
Yeah.
can lead to the same outcome.
Right. So equifinality is crucial in developmental psychopathology.
Okay.
And it reminds us that there's really no single cause for any mental disorder.
Okay.
So different individuals might arrive at the same diagnosis through completely different paths.
Like different routes.
Different routes, but same destination.
But the same destination.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so let's say two people are both diagnosed with depression.
Okay.
One might have a very strong genetic predisposition
Okay.
combined with this early childhood trauma
Right.
that shaped their brain development
Yeah.
and made them more vulnerable to stress.
Okay.
The other person might have no family history of depression. Okay.
But maybe experienced a string of major life stressors
Right.
like job loss, relationship breakdowns, financial strain.
Yeah, things that could trigger it.
Exactly. That triggered their depressive episode.
Wow, so same diagnosis, but very different paths.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's really individualized.
Very much so.
Okay, and can we talk about resilience one more time?
Yeah.
Because if there are so many factors that can contribute to these mental health challenges,
Yeah.
what protects some individuals?
Yeah, so resilience is remarkable. It's really our ability to adapt, cope, and even thrive in the face of adversity.
Okay.
And it's not about having this tough personality or gritting our teeth through tough times.
Right.
It's really about a combination of internal resources,
Okay.
like strong coping skills, a positive outlook, and this sense of purpose. And external resources like supportive relationships,
Okay.
access to resources, and a safe and stable environment.
So those internal and external factors all contribute to that resilience. Yeah, it's like having both the inner strength and the outer lifelines to navigate those challenges.
But what fosters resilience? Can it be learned or strengthened?
That's a great question. And the answer is it's a bit of both.
Okay.
So some people might have this genetic predisposition that makes them naturally more resilient,
Okay.
while others might develop resilience through their life experiences and the support that they receive.
Okay.
But the good news is that resilience is a skill
Okay.
that can be cultivated and strengthened throughout life.
I like that. So even if you've been through a lot and your resilience has been eroded,
Right.
you can rebuild it.
You can.
Okay, how do we foster resilience?
So building strong social connections is key.
Okay.
Nurturing those relationships that give us that sense of belonging
Right.
and act as a buffer against stress.
Okay.
Developing healthy coping skills is also crucial.
Okay.
So learning how to manage stress, regulate emotions, and navigate those challenging situations effectively. And then never underestimate the power of cultivating a positive outlook.
Okay.
Focusing on gratitude, finding meaning in life's difficulties,
Right.
and believing in our capacity to overcome obstacles.
So those social connections, those coping skills, and that positive outlook,
Exactly.
those are all important for building that resilience.
Yeah, and it's really about having those tools and resources to face those anxieties head on.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to the danger of those one-dimensional explanations for these complex human experiences.
Right.
We've seen how psychopathology is influenced by all these factors.
Yeah, this tapestry of factors.
Right. It's important to challenge those simplistic and often misleading explanations that we encounter.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Those simplistic explanations, while tempting, often do more harm than good.
Yeah.
They perpetuate stigma, they lead to blame, and foster this sense of hopelessness. So it's crucial to embrace the complexity of psychopathology to understand there's no single cause for any disorder.
Okay.
And to approach each individual with this holistic and compassionate understanding of their unique journey.
So embracing complexity, challenging stigma, and cultivating compassion.
Yes.
Those are important.
Those are powerful messages to carry with us as we move forward in our understanding of mental health.
Okay, listeners, stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll continue to explore these intricate connections.
Yes.
And uncover those aha moments that illuminate the human experience. Okay. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into psychopathology. We've covered so much already, from genes and brains to thoughts and emotions. I feel like my understanding of mental health has completely changed.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It has.
We've gone beyond those simplistic explanations and really embraced the complexity of this field, and it's time to kind of put it all together.
Right, so we've talked about genetics and neuroscience and these cognitive processes and the power of emotions and the influence of culture and social factors and the importance of taking a developmental perspective.
Right.
But how do we, integrate all these pieces into a cohesive understanding?
That's where the beauty of this multidimensional integrative approach comes in.
Okay.
It's really about recognizing that all these elements are intertwined.
Okay.
They're constantly influencing each other.
So almost like a dance.
Yeah, like a dance, yeah.
And they're all informing each other in this constant back and forth.
Right. It's not about finding the one guilty party.
Right.
It's about understanding the choreography of all these different factors interacting.
I like it. Can you give me a concrete example of how we might apply this approach to a specific disorder?
Sure. Let's take anxiety disorders, which are incredibly common and often quite debilitating.
Yeah, they are.
So from this multidimensional perspective, we'd consider a range of influences. So we might start by looking at genetic predisposition. Are there any inherited vulnerabilities
Right.
that make someone more susceptible to anxiety?
So genetics kind of lays the groundwork.
Well, it lays the foundation, yeah.
But then we'd layer on top of that,
Yeah.
how someone's experiences, especially during childhood,
Exactly.
might have impacted their anxiety levels.
Right. So early childhood experiences, particularly those involving trauma or neglect or insecure attachment, can have a lasting impact on that developing brain.
Okay.
It's almost as if those experiences shape the wiring of our emotional circuitry,
Wow.
making us more sensitive to threat.
So it can actually change the physical structure of our brains.
Yes, it can.
Wow. How do those neurotransmitters fit in?
They play a critical role.
Okay.
So when we talk about anxiety disorders, neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, serotonin, and GABA are particularly important.
Okay, right. So remind me, norepinephrine is involved in that fight or flight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So an overactive norepinephrine system can really contribute to those physical symptoms of anxiety, like the racing heart, the sweating, the trembling.
Right. So it's like our bodies are in that high alert mode even when there's no danger present.
Exactly.
And serotonin and GABA, how do they affect anxiety?
So serotonin helps regulate mood and impulses.
Okay.
And low serotonin activity has been linked to this increased anxiety and worry.
Okay.
And GABA is the brain's off switch. So when GABA activity is low, it's harder to kind of calm down.
Right. Like you can't put the brakes on.
Exactly, those anxious thoughts and feelings.
So you have the genetics and the early experiences and then these neurochemicals kind of like turning up the volume or turning it down.
Exactly. It's like this recipe, right?
Right.
Of different ingredients.
But what about thoughts and behaviors?
Right. So our thoughts and behaviors can play a huge role in maintaining and even escalating anxiety.
Right. Because our thoughts can make things worse.
Exactly.
And our behaviors can kind of reinforce those anxieties.
Absolutely. So think about those common cognitive patterns we see in anxiety disorders, the catastrophizing, anticipating the worst case scenario, assuming that negative events are more likely to happen.
Right.
So these thought patterns can really fuel that cycle.
Right. It's like we're creating these stories in our heads that are making the anxiety worse.
Exactly.
And then our actions can make things worse too, right?
Yeah, so those avoidance behaviors, like steering clear of social situations or public speaking,
Okay.
these can prevent us from having those corrective experiences that might actually help us realize these feared situations aren't as dangerous as we think.
Right. We're not giving ourselves that chance to see that maybe things aren't so bad.
Exactly.
Okay. What about social and cultural factors? What role do they play in anxiety?
So social and cultural factors have a huge impact on how we experience and express anxiety.
Okay.
They influence everything from how we perceive anxiety to the types of stressors we face
Okay.
and the support that's available.
Okay.
Think about cultural expectations around success or perfectionism
Right.
or social status. Those expectations can create this pressure cooker environment.
Right. Like the culture we live in is setting us up
Yeah, for anxiety.
for anxiety. But if we have those supportive relationships and resources, it can help us
Right, exactly.
cope with that.
Yeah, if we don't have those things, it can make it that much harder
Okay.
to deal with.
So even with all these different things contributing to anxiety, there's still that capacity for resilience.
Yes, there is.
So remind me, what is resilience and why is it important when we're talking about anxiety?
So resilience is really our ability to adapt and thrive even in the face of challenges and vulnerabilities.
Right.
It's not about being immune to stress,
Right.
but it's having those inner strengths and outer supports
Right.
that help us navigate those difficult times,
Okay.
learn from our experiences,
Right.
and emerge even stronger.
Okay.
And when it comes to anxiety, resilience can make a huge difference in how well someone copes
Right.
and whether they're able to manage their symptoms effectively.
Okay. So how can we foster resilience both in ourselves and others?
So building strong social connections is really essential, having those supportive relationships.
Right. Those people we can turn to.
Yeah, for encouragement, guidance.
Yeah.
Just a listening ear can make a huge difference.
Right. And developing healthy coping skills is also crucial.
Yes, absolutely.
Learning to manage stress and regulate those emotions.
Right, and navigate those difficult situations.
Okay, so supportive relationships and coping skills are like our armor against anxiety.
They are.
But what about our mindset?
So cultivating a positive outlook, even in the face of challenges, can be really powerful.
Okay.
So it's about focusing on gratitude,
Okay.
finding meaning in our struggles,
Right.
and believing in our ability to overcome obstacle.
So our social connections, our coping skills, and our positive outlook.
Yes.
Those are all really important for building resilience.
Yeah, they're the tools that we need.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into psychopathology,
Yeah.
I want to come back to the importance of resisting those one-dimensional explanations for these complex human experiences.
Yeah, those simplistic explanations, while appealing, they really often miss the mark.
Right.
And they can even be harmful.
Yeah.
They perpetuate stigma, they lead to blame,
Right.
and foster a sense of hopelessness.
Okay.
So it's so important to embrace that complexity of psychopathology.
Okay.
To acknowledge that there's no single cause for any mental health challenge.
Right.
And to approach each individual with a compassionate and nuanced understanding of their unique journey.
So embracing complexity, challenging stigma, and fostering compassion.
Yes, those are really the takeaways from our deep dive today.
Yeah, this has been a truly eye-opening conversation.
It has.
I've learned so much.
Yeah.
And I have a new perspective on psychopathology and a deeper appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit.
That's great to hear. It's been a pleasure exploring this fascinating topic with you.
Me too. And I hope our listeners feel empowered to continue their journey of discovery and to challenge those oversimplified narratives and to embrace the beauty of the human experience.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds open to the wonders and complexities of the human experience.